Marcus is the laziest person I've ever worked with, Sarah announced during the Monday morning team meeting, her voice carrying that particular tone of exasperation that comes from watching someone succeed while appearing to do nothing. He leaves at exactly 5 every day, never works weekends, and somehow still meets all his deadlines. It's not fair to the rest of us who actually put in effort. I sat there quietly, sipping my coffee and listening to my colleagues enumerate my apparent sins against corporate culture. The irony wasn't lost on me that this conversation was happening at 7 a.m., during a meeting that could have been an email, while we discussed quarterly targets that had been artificially inflated to justify everyone's 60-hour work weeks. Marcus doesn't seem to understand what dedication means, added Tom from accounting, who'd been working late every night for 3 years and had exactly the same job title he'd started with. While we're all staying late to get things done, he just walks out like he doesn't care about the company. My manager, Janet, looked at me expectantly. Marcus, would you like to respond to these concerns about your work ethic? I considered explaining my actual approach to work, how I'd automated most of my routine tasks, streamlined processes that everyone else did manually, and completed projects efficiently because I'd learned to identify what actually mattered versus what just looked busy. Instead, I smiled and said, I always meet my deadlines and exceed my targets. I thought that was what mattered. It's about more than just meeting minimums, Sarah shot back. It's about showing commitment, being part of the team, going above and beyond. Going above and beyond in our office culture meant staying late for the sake of appearing dedicated, attending unnecessary meetings, and creating busy work to fill time. I'd watched people spend hours on tasks I could complete in 30 minutes, not because they were less capable, but because they'd never questioned whether there might be better ways to approach their work. The meeting concluded with Janet assigning me additional responsibilities to help develop my leadership potential, which everyone understood meant punishment for my perceived laziness. My colleagues seemed satisfied that justice was being served. That evening, while my coworkers stayed late to handle their expanded workloads, I went home to my small apartment and opened my laptop. Not for more work. I'd finished everything by 3 p.m., but to check my investment accounts and update my retirement projections. 3 years earlier, I'd started reading about financial independence and early retirement. The concept was simple. Live below your means, invest the difference, and achieve enough passive income to make traditional employment optional. What had captured my attention wasn't just the financial freedom but the efficiency mindset that made it possible. While my colleagues competed to see who could work the most hours, I'd begun competing to see how much value I could create in the least time possible. Every process I streamlined, every automation I implemented, every meeting I made unnecessary didn't just improve my work life, it freed up mental energy to focus on building wealth outside of work. I'd started with small changes. Instead of spending lunch breaks complaining about management like everyone else, I'd study financial markets and read investment strategies. Instead of working late to impress supervisors who never seemed to notice anyway, I'd leave on time and spend evenings learning about real estate, index funds, and tax optimization. The criticism about my work ethic had started almost immediately. Colleagues interpreted my efficiency as laziness and my boundaries as lack of commitment. They couldn't understand how someone who appeared to work less could consistently deliver better results. The secret wasn't that I was smarter or more talented than anyone else. I'd simply realized that most workplace activities were theater designed to create the appearance of productivity rather than actual value creation. While everyone else performed busyness, I focused on outcomes. Within 6 months of starting my financial independence journey, I'd paid off my student loans by selling a car I didn't need and moving to a smaller apartment closer to work. My colleagues saw this as evidence of my lack of ambition. Why would someone voluntarily downsize unless they were struggling? Marcus is really going downhill, I'd overheard Tom telling Sarah. Did you see his apartment when we dropped off those reports? Barely any furniture, no nice car. I think he's having money problems. They couldn't conceive that someone might choose simplicity over status symbols, that financial security might be more valuable than appearing successful. While they upgraded their lifestyles with every raise, taking on larger mortgages and car payments that required them to work even harder, I was building a foundation that would eventually make work optional. My investment strategy was deliberately boring. I put 80% of my income into low-cost index funds, reinvesting all dividends. I avoided individual stock picking, cryptocurrency speculation, and get-rich-quick schemes that promised shortcuts. Instead, I relied on compound interest and time, the most powerful combination in wealth building that most people ignored because it wasn't exciting. By the end of my second year, my investment account had grown larger than my annual salary. Not because of extraordinary returns, but because I was saving and investing such a high percentage of my income. My colleagues who earned similar salaries had almost nothing in savings because their expenses had expanded to match their incomes. "Marcus, you need to start thinking about your career trajectory," Janet had told me during my annual review. "The partners are concerned that you're not showing enough ambition. Maybe you should consider working toward an MBA, taking on more visible projects." The MBA would have cost 2 years and 6 figures in debt. The visible projects she mentioned were largely political exercises that would require extensive overtime without additional compensation. From a career advancement perspective, her advice made perfect sense. From a financial independence perspective, it was exactly backwards. "I'm happy with my current role," I'd replied. "I enjoy the work and feel like I'm contributing value." Janet had looked puzzled by this response. In corporate culture, expressing satisfaction with your current position was interpreted as lack of drive. Ambition was supposed to mean constantly seeking promotion, regardless of whether those promotions actually improved your life or just added stress and responsibility. The third year had brought more criticism as my work efficiency continued to improve while my lifestyle remained deliberately modest. I'd developed systems for completing most of my tasks in half the time my colleagues required, which meant I could maintain excellent performance while working what appeared to be part-time hours. "It's honestly insulting," Sarah had complained to Janet loud enough for me to hear. "We're all working our tails off while Marcus coasts along. He's probably looking for another job and just checking out mentally." I wasn't looking for another job. I was 8 months away from having enough invested assets to cover my basic living expenses indefinitely. At my current savings rate, I'd reach complete financial independence, enough passive income to maintain my preferred lifestyle without any employment income within 2 years. The morning of my resignation, I'd watched my colleagues arrive looking exhausted from another late night at the office. Tom had been there until midnight working on a presentation that would probably be glanced at briefly and then forgotten. Sarah had come in early to catch up on emails that had accumulated while she'd been in meetings the previous day. "Marcus," Janet called me into her office after the morning team meeting, "we need to discuss your performance issues. Several team members have raised concerns about your commitment level, and frankly, I'm starting to agree with them." "What specific performance issues?" I asked, genuinely curious. "It's not about your output. Your work quality is fine. It's about your attitude, your engagement, your willingness to go above and beyond for the team." "I see. I'd prepared for this conversation for months. Janet, I'd like to give my notice. Today will be my last day." The silence that followed was profound. Janet had clearly expected to deliver a warning or place me on some kind of performance improvement plan. My resignation had caught her completely off guard. "Are you going to a competitor because you know you signed a non-compete agreement?" "I'm not going to a competitor. I'm retiring." "Retiring? Marcus, you're 35 years old." "Yes, I know." The news spread through the office within an hour. The reactions ranged from disbelief to skepticism to anger. How could someone they'd characterized as lazy and unmotivated afford to retire 3 decades before normal retirement age? "There's no way Marcus has enough money to retire," Tom announced during lunch. "He must have family money or he's lying about retiring. Maybe he got fired and is too embarrassed to admit it." Sarah was more direct in her accusations. "He was probably embezzling money or running some kind of side business using company resources. Normal people can't retire at 35, especially people who don't even work hard." The truth was simpler and more threatening to their worldview than any conspiracy theory. I'd achieved financial independence through basic principles that anyone could have followed: living below my means, investing consistently, and focusing on efficiency over appearances. While they'd been competing to see who could work the most hours, I'd been competing to see how much wealth I could build with the least effort. While they'd been upgrading their lifestyles with every raise, I'd been maintaining the same modest expenses and investing the difference. While they'd been playing office politics to advance their careers, I'd been building systems that would make careers optional. My final day was surprisingly emotional. Despite their criticism of my work ethic, my colleagues had come to rely on my efficiency and problem-solving abilities. The processes I'd developed to streamline our workflows would save them hundreds of hours, though they'd probably never acknowledge that my laziness had actually made their jobs easier. "I still don't understand how you did this," Janet said during my exit interview. "Your salary was good but not extraordinary. Where did the money come from?" I pulled up a simple spreadsheet showing my income, expenses, and investment growth over the past 3 years. The math was straightforward. Earn money, spend much less than you earn, invest the difference in diversified index funds, repeat consistently over time. "This is it?" she asked, studying the numbers. "Just regular investing." "Just regular investing. The key was keeping my expenses low and my savings rate high. Compound interest did the rest." "But what about your lifestyle, your social life? You can't have any fun if you're saving 80% of your income." "I had plenty of fun. I just didn't equate spending money with enjoyment. Most of my favorite activities, reading, hiking, learning new skills, were either free or very inexpensive. I spent money on things that actually improved my life and avoided spending on things that just made me appear successful." Janet shook her head. "I wish I'd known this was possible when I was your age." "It's not too late to start," I replied. "The principles work at any age, though the timeline is longer if you start later." But I knew she wouldn't make significant changes. Like most people, she was too invested in her current lifestyle and too skeptical that simple strategies could produce extraordinary results. She'd continue working 60-hour weeks, competing for promotions that came with more stress than additional income, while telling herself that people like me were just lucky or had some unfair advantage. 6 months after my retirement, I received a LinkedIn message from Sarah. She'd been promoted to my old position and was struggling with the workload. Could I help her understand the systems I'd developed to manage everything so efficiently? I spent an afternoon showing her the automation tools, process improvements, and workflow optimizations I'd created. She was amazed by how much time they saved, and frustrated that she'd never thought to question whether there were better ways to approach the work. "You weren't lazy at all," she admitted. "You were just working smarter than the rest of us. I feel stupid for not seeing it." "You weren't stupid," I replied. "You were operating within a culture that rewards visible effort over effective results. It's hard to step outside that mindset when everyone around you reinforces it." "Do you think I could do what you did, the financial independence thing?" "Absolutely. You earn more now than I ever did. If you're willing to question some assumptions about what you actually need to spend money on, you could probably retire even earlier than I did." She seemed interested but skeptical. Making the lifestyle changes necessary for financial independence required admitting that much of what she'd been working toward, the bigger house, the luxury car, the expensive vacations, were obstacles to freedom rather than signs of success. A year into retirement, I was contacted by a local financial planning firm that had heard about my story. They wanted me to speak at a seminar about early retirement strategies. The audience was mostly people in their 40s and 50s, who'd begun to question whether working until 65 was really their only option. "The biggest obstacle to financial independence isn't income," I told them. "It's the belief that you need to spend most of what you earn to have a good life. Once you separate your self-worth from your spending patterns, building wealth becomes a straightforward math problem." The questions afterward revealed how challenging this mindset shift could be for people who'd spent decades equating consumption with success. "But what about keeping up with your peers?" one attendee asked. "If you're driving an old car and living in a small apartment, won't people think you're unsuccessful?" "Some people will think that," I agreed. "The question is whether their opinions are worth more to you than your freedom." "What do you do all day now that you're retired?" "Everything I never had time for when I was working. I read voraciously, travel extensively, volunteer for causes I care about, and pursue hobbies that interest me. I also manage my investments, which takes a few hours per week. The difference is that I choose how to spend my time instead of having that choice made for me." 2 years after my retirement, Tom reached out with news that the company was restructuring. Several positions, including Janet's, were being eliminated. People who'd worked there for decades were suddenly unemployed, with mortgages and car payments that required immediate replacement income. "I keep thinking about how you left when you did," he wrote. "At the time, we all thought you were crazy or irresponsible. Now I realize you were the only one who really understood how employment works. Companies don't owe us loyalty, so we shouldn't organize our lives around the assumption that our jobs are permanent." Tom had started reading about financial independence and was making changes to his spending and investing habits. He was frustrated that he'd waited so long to begin, but motivated by the realization that even starting in his mid-40s, he could achieve financial security much earlier than traditional retirement age. "The hardest part," he admitted, "is changing habits that I've had for 20 years. I'd gotten used to spending every raise, buying things I didn't really need, and assuming I'd always have a paycheck coming in." I encouraged him to be patient with himself. Behavioral change takes time, especially when it requires rejecting cultural messages about success and consumption that most people never question. 5 years after my retirement, I was living exactly the life I'd envisioned when I started my financial independence journey. My investment portfolio had grown large enough to support a more comfortable lifestyle, but I'd discovered that having enough money made me less interested in spending it rather than more. The freedom to choose how to spend my time had proven more valuable than any material possession I could have purchased. I'd traveled to countries I'd always wanted to visit, learned skills I'd never had time to develop, and built relationships that weren't constrained by work schedules and career pressures. My former colleagues, meanwhile, were still trapped in the same cycles of overwork and lifestyle inflation that had kept them from building wealth when we'd worked together. They earned more money now but had even less freedom because their expenses had grown faster than their incomes. Sarah had been promoted again and was making nearly twice what I'd earned in my final year. She was also working 70-hour weeks, managing a team of 15 people, and dealing with stress levels that required prescription medication to manage. "I keep meaning to start investing seriously," she told me during a coffee meeting, "but between work and everything else, I can never find the time to research strategies or set up accounts." "You don't need to research complex strategies," I reminded her. "Simple index fund investing through a 401k or IRA takes about an hour to set up and 10 minutes per month to maintain." I know. It's just that with everything going on, I can't focus on long-term planning. I'm too busy dealing with immediate deadlines and crises." This was the trap that kept most people from achieving financial independence. They were so busy managing the demands of their current lifestyle that they couldn't invest time in strategies that would reduce those demands. The busier work made them, the more they needed work to sustain their increasingly expensive lives. Janet had found another position after the company restructuring, but at a lower salary with a longer commute. She'd been forced to refinance her mortgage and was considering taking on consulting work to maintain her previous income level. "I wish I'd listened to you about lifestyle inflation," she admitted. "Every time I got a raise, I found ways to spend it instead of saving it. Now I'm stuck needing this specific income level to maintain payments on things I probably didn't need in the first place." Her situation illustrated why financial independence required intentional lifestyle design rather than just high income. She'd earned well over $1 million during her career but had almost nothing to show for it, except possessions that now trapped her in continued employment. 10 years after my retirement, I was occasionally invited to speak at universities about alternative approaches to career planning. Students were usually surprised to learn that financial independence was possible on moderate incomes with sufficient time and discipline. "But don't you get bored without the challenge and stimulation of work?" one student asked during a Q&A session. "I've never been less bored in my life," I replied. "When you're not spending 40 hours per week on someone else's priorities, you have enormous time to pursue your own interests and challenges. What if you want to make a difference in the world? How do you create impact without a career?" Financial independence gave me more opportunities to create meaningful impact, not fewer. I can volunteer for causes I care about without worrying about income. I can take risks on projects that matter to me without jeopardizing my financial security. I can make decisions based on values rather than paycheck requirements. The question revealed a common misconception about retirement, that it meant withdrawal from productive activity rather than freedom to choose which activities to pursue. My post-career life was more purposeful and impactful than my employment had ever been, precisely because I could focus on outcomes rather than income. Some students were inspired by the possibility of designing their careers around financial independence goals. Others seemed overwhelmed by the discipline required to live significantly below their future earning potential. A few dismissed the entire concept as unrealistic or overly restrictive. "I don't want to live like a monk just to retire early," one student declared. "Life is for living, not just saving money." "I agree that life is for living," I replied. "The question is whether you're more alive when you're spending money on things you don't really need, or when you have the freedom to spend your time on experiences and relationships that actually matter to you." 15 years after being called lazy for leaving work on time and refusing to participate in overtime culture, I reflected on how thoroughly my former colleagues had misunderstood what they were witnessing. They'd interpreted efficiency as laziness, boundaries as lack of commitment, and intentional simplicity as failure to achieve success. In reality, I'd been demonstrating principles that could have transformed all of their lives if they'd been willing to question their assumptions about work, money, and success. Instead of learning from approaches that produced better results with less effort, they'd reinforced cultural norms that kept everyone trapped in cycles of overwork and financial insecurity. The irony was that their criticism had actually helped me succeed. Being dismissed as lazy meant I faced no pressure to conform to their unsustainable work patterns. Being excluded from their lifestyle competitions meant I avoided the spending pressures that kept them financially dependent on jobs they increasingly disliked. My former colleagues had wanted me to work harder and spend more so I'd be as trapped as they were. When I refused to participate in their mutual imprisonment, they'd interpreted my freedom as laziness, rather than recognizing it as a different approach to life design. 20 years after my retirement, I was contacted by a journalist writing about the growing financial independence movement. She wanted to understand how people were achieving early retirement despite stagnant wages and increasing costs of living. "The key insight," I explained, "is that most of what we consider necessary spending is actually optional consumption driven by social pressure and marketing rather than genuine need. Once you separate your actual requirements from your culturally imposed wants, building wealth becomes much more achievable." But doesn't that require significant sacrifice? How do you maintain relationships and social connections when you're not participating in expensive activities? It requires being intentional about what you value and why. I've found that the best relationships are built around shared interests and mutual support rather than shared consumption patterns. Friends who only want to connect through expensive activities probably aren't friends worth having. The journalist had struggled with this concept during her own attempts at financial independence. Like many people, she discovered that reducing spending meant confronting social pressures and personal insecurities that she'd been avoiding through consumption. "The hardest part for me was realizing how much of my identity was tied to what I owned and how I appeared to others," she admitted. "Changing my spending habits meant changing my understanding of who I was." This was the deeper challenge of financial independence. It required developing self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation through possessions or lifestyle displays. For people who'd built their identities around consumption patterns, saving money felt like erasing themselves. My story had become part of a growing movement of people who were rejecting traditional career timelines in favor of intentional life design. The internet had made it easier to find communities of like-minded individuals and access information about alternative approaches to money and work. 20 years ago, when you retired, this was much more unusual, the journalist observed. Now there are entire online communities devoted to financial independence strategies. Do you think this represents a fundamental shift in how people think about careers? "I think it represents people realizing they have more choices than they were taught to believe," I replied. The traditional career model worked well for previous generations who had pensions, job security, and predictable economic conditions. Those conditions no longer exist, so people are developing new strategies. The financial independence movement was growing because traditional employment was becoming less reliable, while the tools for building wealth independently were becoming more accessible. People were discovering that they didn't need to depend on employers for security when they could create their own through disciplined saving and investing. My former colleagues, now in their 50s, were beginning to understand what I'd tried to demonstrate 20 years earlier. Tom had finally achieved a modest level of financial independence, though he planned to work several more years to build additional security. Sarah had burned out from management stress and taken a lower-paying position with better work-life balance. Janet had never recovered financially from the company restructuring 15 years earlier. She had spent her career climbing the corporate ladder without building wealth independently, leaving her vulnerable when external circumstances changed. She was still working at 62, hoping to save enough for a minimal retirement. "I think about your approach all the time," she told me during a chance encounter at a coffee shop. "I used to think you were lazy or unmotivated, but you are actually the smartest person in the office. You understood something about work and money that the rest of us missed." "It wasn't about intelligence," I replied. "It was about questioning assumptions that everyone else took for granted. Most people never examine whether working harder actually produces better life outcomes. What would you tell your younger self if you could go back? To start even earlier and save even more aggressively." "I could have retired at 30 if I'd begun immediately after college, instead of spending 2 years living paycheck to paycheck." The conversation reminded me how much cultural conditioning shapes our understanding of what's possible. My colleagues had dismissed financial independence as unrealistic because they'd never seen anyone achieve it, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where people didn't pursue strategies they'd never witnessed working. Breaking that cycle required individuals willing to experiment with different approaches despite social pressure to conform. Once enough people demonstrated that alternative strategies worked, others became willing to consider them. 25 years after being called lazy for leaving work on time, I was living proof that efficiency, boundaries, and intentional simplicity could produce extraordinary freedom. The colleagues who'd criticized my work ethic were still working, still stressed, still trapped in the same patterns that had consumed their lives when we'd worked together. They'd been absolutely right about one thing: I was different from them. I just wasn't lazy. I was strategic. 25 years after being called lazy for leaving work on time, I was living proof that efficiency, boundaries, and intentional simplicity could produce extraordinary freedom. The colleagues who'd criticized my work ethic were still working, still stressed, still trapped in the same patterns that had consumed their lives when we'd worked together. They'd been absolutely right about one thing: I was different from them. I just wasn't lazy. I was strategic. The irony deepened when I received an invitation to speak at my old company's annual leadership conference. The organization had been struggling with employee burnout, high turnover, and declining productivity. Management consultants had recommended implementing work-life balance initiatives and sustainable performance practices, concepts that sounded remarkably similar to the boundaries I'd maintained 25 years earlier. "We'd like you to share your perspective on sustainable career development," the invitation read. "Your unique approach to work efficiency and long-term planning could provide valuable insights for our current leadership team." The company that had once viewed my work practices as laziness now wanted to pay me to teach those same practices to their executives. The transformation was complete. My supposed character flaws had become sought-after leadership skills. Standing in the same conference room where I'd once been criticized for lacking commitment, I looked out at an audience of burned-out managers and overworked directors. Their faces showed the strain of years spent believing that working harder was the only path to success. "How many of you," I began, "have had weeks where you worked 60 hours but felt like you accomplished nothing important?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. "How many of you have subordinates who seem constantly busy but rarely deliver exceptional results?" Again, most hands rose. The problem isn't that people don't work hard enough. The problem is that most organizations reward visible effort over effective outcomes, creating cultures where people optimize for appearing busy rather than creating value. I spent the next hour outlining principles I'd discovered decades earlier: how to identify high-impact activities, eliminate low-value work, and design systems that produce better results with less effort. The audience was fascinated by concepts that had once been dismissed as laziness. "But how do you maintain team cohesion when individuals work different hours or approaches?" one executive asked. "Don't you need everyone following the same schedule and practices?" "Team cohesion comes from shared goals and mutual support, not from synchronized schedules," I replied. Some people do their best work early in the morning, others late at night. Some need quiet focus time. Others thrive in collaborative environments. Forcing everyone into identical patterns reduces overall effectiveness. The questions revealed how much corporate culture had evolved since my departure. Terms like, quote, psychological safety, authentic leadership, and sustainable performance were now common vocabulary. Yet many organizations still struggled to implement these concepts because they conflicted with deeply ingrained beliefs about work and productivity. After the presentation, Sarah approached me. She'd been promoted to senior vice president but looked exhausted despite her professional success. "I've been thinking about our conversation from 20 years ago," she said. "You offered to help me understand financial independence, and I dismissed it as unrealistic. I think I was wrong." "It's never too late to start," I replied, "though the timeline is different when you begin later in life. I'm making good money now, but I'm trapped by my lifestyle. The house, the car payments, the private school tuition. I need this income level to maintain everything I've committed to." Sarah's situation illustrated the golden handcuffs that trapped many high earners. Success had brought increased expenses that required continued success to maintain. She'd climbed the corporate ladder only to discover that each rung made it harder to step away. "What would happen if you simplified your lifestyle?" I asked. "If you downsized the house, bought used cars, sent the kids to public school?" "My family would hate it. My neighbors would think we were struggling. My kids would be angry about changing schools." "So you're working 60-hour weeks to maintain other people's approval?" The question hung in the air. Sarah had achieved everything she'd been taught to want: high income, prestigious position, expensive lifestyle, but had lost the freedom to choose how to spend her time. She was successful by conventional metrics but trapped by the very achievements that were supposed to liberate her. "I don't know how to break the cycle," she admitted. "Every time I think about making changes, I imagine all the reactions and conversations I'd have to deal with. It's easier to just keep working." This was the psychological trap that kept people in unsustainable patterns. The fear of social judgment often outweighed the desire for personal freedom. People would rather remain stressed and overworked than face questions about why they'd chosen to live differently. "The judgment is temporary," I told her, "but the freedom is permanent. People adjust to your choices faster than you expect, and those who don't adjust probably weren't worth impressing anyway." 6 months later, Sarah reached out with news that she'd made significant changes. She'd sold the large house and bought a smaller one closer to work. She'd traded in both luxury cars for reliable used vehicles. She'd moved her children to public schools and discovered they were actually higher quality than the private institutions she'd been paying for. "The kids were upset at first," she reported, "but they've adapted better than I expected. My neighbors did ask questions, but mostly they seemed curious rather than judgmental. A few admitted they'd been considering similar changes themselves." The lifestyle changes had reduced her monthly expenses by over 60% while improving her quality of life. The shorter commute gave her more time with family. The smaller house required less maintenance. The children were thriving in their new schools and had made friends in their neighborhood. "Most importantly," she said, "I've started saving aggressively for the first time in my career. I might not be able to retire at 35 like you did, but I could potentially retire at 55 instead of 67. Sarah's transformation inspired other executives in the company. Word spread about her lifestyle changes and the financial benefits they'd produced. Several colleagues began questioning their own spending patterns and exploring financial independence strategies. "It's becoming a movement here," Tom told me during a phone call. He'd been promoted to director after surviving several rounds of layoffs, but was planning his own exit strategy. "People are realizing that the traditional career path isn't working anymore. Job security is an illusion, and working until 67 assumes you'll stay healthy and employed for decades." Tom had been steadily building wealth for 15 years since our earlier conversation. His progress was slower than mine had been, but he was on track to achieve financial independence by his early 50s. More importantly, he'd fundamentally changed his relationship with work and money. "I used to think people who retired early were lucky or privileged," he said. "Now I understand it's about making different choices about what's important. I'd rather have freedom than status symbols." The company had begun implementing policies that supported sustainable work practices. They'd eliminated unnecessary meetings, reduced email volume, and encouraged employees to focus on outcomes rather than hours worked. Productivity had increased while stress levels decreased. "It's ironic," the current CEO told me during a follow-up consultation. "The practices we once viewed as laziness are now considered best practices in performance management. We're teaching people to work the way you worked here 25 years ago." What changed? We started measuring what actually matters instead of what's easy to measure. When you evaluate people based on results rather than activity, you discover that the most effective performers often work differently than everyone else. The transformation reflected broader changes in how organizations thought about work and productivity. The rise of remote work, flexible schedules, and results-oriented performance metrics had validated approaches that had once been considered unconventional. Meanwhile, my personal life had evolved in ways I couldn't have predicted when I'd first retired. The freedom to pursue interests without financial pressure had led to opportunities I'd never imagined during my corporate career. I'd become an informal advisor to the financial independence movement, helping people develop strategies for early retirement based on their specific circumstances and goals. This work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in traditional employment because it directly improved people's lives in measurable ways. "You've helped me realize that money is just a tool for buying freedom," one client told me. "I'd been trying to buy happiness with consumption, but what I actually wanted was autonomy and choice." The consulting work had also become surprisingly lucrative. Companies were willing to pay substantial fees for expertise in sustainable performance and work-life integration. I was earning more per hour than I'd ever made as an employee, but working fewer hours because I could choose only the most interesting and impactful projects. "Don't you miss the structure and social connections of regular employment?" people often asked. "I have more structure now because I design my own schedule around my energy patterns and priorities," I replied. "And my social connections are deeper because they're based on shared interests rather than proximity and convenience." The question revealed assumptions about work that many people never examined. Employment provided structure and social connections, but it also imposed constraints that prevented people from developing more authentic relationships and more effective personal systems. My social circle now included people from diverse backgrounds who'd achieved financial independence through various paths. Some were entrepreneurs who'd built businesses they eventually sold. Others were corporate executives who'd saved aggressively during high-earning years. A few were teachers or social workers who'd achieved early retirement through extreme frugality and creative income strategies. The common thread isn't income level or career choice, I observed during a gathering of early retirees. It's the willingness to question conventional wisdom about money and work. The group included a former investment banker who'd retired at 32 after living on 20% of his income for 8 years. There was a nurse who'd achieved financial independence at 45 by house hacking and geographic arbitrage. A software developer had retired at 38 by creating passive income streams through real estate and index fund investing. What's interesting, the former banker noted, is that everyone thought we were crazy while we were pursuing these strategies. Now that we've achieved financial independence, people want to know our secrets. "The secrets aren't complicated," the nurse added. "Live below your means, invest consistently, and ignore social pressure to spend money on things that don't actually improve your life." But simple doesn't mean easy. The psychological challenges of financial independence were often more difficult than the financial mechanics. People had to overcome decades of conditioning about consumption, status, and social expectations. They had to develop self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation through possessions or lifestyle displays. The hardest part for me was learning to define success for myself rather than accepting society's definition, the software developer said. I had to stop caring about what my colleagues thought about my old car and small apartment. These conversations reminded me why my former colleagues had found my work practices so threatening. I hadn't just been demonstrating different approaches to productivity. I'd been challenging fundamental assumptions about what constituted a successful life. 30 years after my retirement, I was invited to speak at a conference about the future of work. The audience included executives, entrepreneurs, and policymakers discussing how automation and artificial intelligence would reshape employment. "The question isn't whether technology will eliminate jobs," I told them. The question is whether we'll use technological advancement to create more freedom for human beings, or just more efficient ways to keep people trapped in unnecessary work. The presentation focused on how financial independence strategies could help people navigate economic uncertainty and technological disruption. Instead of fearing automation, people could prepare for it by building wealth that provided security, regardless of employment circumstances. When you're not dependent on a paycheck for survival, I explained, you can view technological change as an opportunity rather than a threat. You can retrain for new fields, start businesses, or pursue meaningful work that might not be highly paid but contributes value to society. The audience was receptive to these ideas, but many expressed skepticism about whether financial independence was achievable for average workers facing stagnant wages and increasing costs. Isn't early retirement just a privilege available to high earners in technology or finance? One attendee asked. What about teachers, social workers, or other people in essential but lower-paid professions? Financial independence is more achievable for high earners, but it's not exclusive to them, I replied. I know teachers who've retired in their 40s through careful saving and investing. The key is starting early and being consistent, regardless of income level. I shared examples of people who'd achieved financial independence on modest incomes, through strategies like house hacking, geographic arbitrage, and extreme frugality. These approaches required more creativity and sacrifice than high-income strategies, but they were possible for people willing to make significant lifestyle changes. The fundamental principle applies at any income level, I continued. If you can live on less than you earn and invest the difference consistently over time, you can build wealth that provides financial security. The timeline varies based on income and expenses, but the outcome is achievable. After the presentation, I was approached by a group of young professionals who were interested in applying financial independence principles to their careers. They'd been inspired by examples of people who'd achieved early retirement, but weren't sure how to adapt those strategies to their specific circumstances. We're teachers and social workers, one explained. We love our work but hate the financial stress. We want to build wealth so we can continue doing meaningful work without worrying about money. This was a common motivation among younger people interested in financial independence. Rather than seeking early retirement, they wanted financial security that would allow them to pursue purpose-driven work without sacrificing their ability to support themselves and their families. What if we approached financial independence as a way to enable more meaningful work rather than escape from work entirely, I suggested. When you're not dependent on maximum income for survival, you can choose positions based on impact and satisfaction rather than just compensation. The group was energized by this framing. They began developing strategies for building wealth while continuing in their chosen professions. Some planned to increase their income through side businesses or additional certifications. Others focused on reducing expenses through lifestyle changes and geographic arbitrage. We're calling it FI for social good, one teacher explained. The goal isn't to retire early, but to achieve financial independence that supports our ability to do work that matters. This evolution of the financial independence movement reflected broader changes in how people thought about careers and life design. Younger generations were less interested in traditional markers of success and more focused on creating lives that aligned with their values and priorities. The conversation reminded me of my own motivation for pursuing financial independence. I hadn't been trying to escape work entirely. I'd been seeking the freedom to choose work that was meaningful rather than just financially necessary. The beautiful thing about financial independence, I told them, is that it transforms your relationship with work. When you don't need a paycheck to survive, you can pursue opportunities based on interest and impact rather than just compensation. 35 years after being called lazy for leaving work on time, I reflected on how thoroughly the world had changed. The practices that had once been dismissed as laziness were now considered best practices in performance management. The financial strategies that had once been viewed as extreme frugality were now mainstream approaches to wealth building. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated many of these trends. Remote work had become commonplace, proving that productivity didn't require physical presence in an office. People had reassessed their priorities and realized that many of the things they'd been working toward weren't actually important to their happiness or well-being. The pandemic was a wake-up call, Sarah told me during a recent conversation. People realized that life is short and unpredictable. Working 60 hours a week to afford things you don't really need seems insane when you might not be here next year. Sarah had achieved her goal of retiring at 55, 5 years ahead of schedule. She was now volunteering for nonprofit organizations and spending time with her grandchildren. Her former colleagues were still working, still stressed, still trapped in the same patterns that had consumed their lives for decades. "I think about what my life would have been like if I'd listened to you 30 years ago," she said. "I could have retired at 35 like you did. I could have spent the last 20 years doing whatever I wanted, instead of working in jobs that were slowly killing me." "But you made the changes when you were ready," I replied. "Timing matters, but it's not everything. You still achieved financial independence 15 years earlier than most people. That's extraordinary." The regret was understandable but unnecessary. Every person's journey was different, and comparing outcomes across different circumstances and time periods wasn't productive. What mattered was that she'd eventually recognized the possibility of different choices and acted on that recognition. "What advice would you give to someone starting their career today?" she asked. "Question everything," I said. Question whether you need to work as many hours as everyone else. Question whether you need to spend as much money as everyone else. Question whether the definition of success that's been handed to you actually makes sense for your life. Most importantly, understand that you have more choices than you think. The conventional path isn't the only path, and it's not necessarily the best path for everyone. The conversation continued for hours, covering topics we'd never discussed during our years as colleagues. We talked about the psychology of money, the relationship between work and identity, and the importance of designing life around values rather than expectations. "I wish we'd had conversations like this when we were working together," Sarah said. "Maybe we could have all made better choices if we'd been willing to question our assumptions." "We weren't ready for these conversations then," I replied. "People have to be open to hearing different perspectives, and that often requires experiencing the limitations of conventional approaches firsthand." The willingness to question assumptions was still rare, even decades after the financial independence movement had proven that alternative approaches were possible. Most people continued to follow traditional career paths because they were familiar and socially acceptable, not because they were optimal. "Change is hard," Sarah acknowledged. "Even when you know better approaches exist, it's difficult to break patterns that have been reinforced for decades." "But it's possible," I reminded her. "You're proof that people can change their relationship with work and money at any stage of life. It's never too late to start making different choices." 40 years after my retirement, I was invited to speak at the university where I'd earned my degree. The business school was developing a curriculum about alternative career paths and wanted to include perspectives from people who'd achieved success through unconventional approaches. "How do you define success?" the dean asked during our preliminary conversation. "The ability to choose how to spend your time based on your values rather than your financial obligations," I replied. "Success isn't about how much money you make or what position you hold. It's about having the freedom to make decisions based on what matters to you." The definition would have been considered radical 40 years earlier. Now it was becoming mainstream as more people recognized the limitations of traditional career success metrics. The students I spoke with were different from my generation in fundamental ways. They'd grown up with examples of people who'd achieved financial independence through various paths. They'd witnessed the 2008 financial crisis, the pandemic, and multiple economic disruptions that had demonstrated the fragility of traditional employment security. "We don't trust that working for the same company for 30 years will provide retirement security," one student explained. "We've seen our parents' generation get laid off after decades of loyalty. We're planning for a different kind of career." "What does that look like?" I asked. "Multiple income streams, location independence, and building wealth that doesn't depend on traditional employment," she replied. "We want to create security for ourselves rather than depending on employers or government programs." The students were applying financial independence principles from the beginning of their careers rather than discovering them after decades of conventional employment. They were making decisions about education, career choice, and lifestyle based on long-term wealth building rather than short-term income maximization. "Is there anything you'd do differently if you were starting your career today?" another student asked. I'd start even earlier and be more aggressive about building wealth, I replied. I'd also focus more on developing skills that create value regardless of employment circumstances, entrepreneurship, investing, and creative problem solving. The world is changing faster than ever before. The careers that exist today might not exist in 10 years. The skills that matter most are adaptability, creativity, and financial literacy. The conversation reminded me of how much had changed since my retirement. The financial independence movement had evolved from a niche concept to a mainstream strategy. Universities were teaching courses about early retirement and alternative career paths. Companies were implementing policies that supported sustainable work practices. "You were ahead of your time," one professor observed. "The approaches you pioneered 40 years ago are now considered standard practice in progressive organizations." "I wasn't ahead of my time," I replied. "I was just willing to question assumptions that everyone else accepted without examination. The principles haven't changed. People are just more open to hearing them now." The timing had been crucial to my success. Retiring early when few people understood the concept meant facing skepticism and criticism. But it also meant having decades to enjoy the benefits of financial independence. Starting later in life was still valuable, but the timeline and lifestyle impacts were different. "What's next for the financial independence movement?" the dean asked. "Integration with broader social and economic policy," I predicted. "As more people achieve financial independence, we'll see discussions about universal basic income, reduced work weeks, and economic systems that prioritize human well-being over GDP growth." The movement is evolving from individual strategy to social transformation. People are realizing that financial independence isn't just about personal freedom. It's about creating economic systems that support human flourishing. The conversation continued long after the formal presentation ended. Faculty and students were hungry for perspectives on how to navigate an uncertain economic future and create lives that balanced financial security with meaningful work. "The most important lesson," I told them, "is that you don't have to accept a conventional timeline for career and retirement. You can design your own path based on your values and priorities. But that requires courage. It requires being willing to be different from everyone else and to face criticism from people who don't understand your choices. The criticism is temporary, but the freedom is permanent." And increasingly, the people who thought you were crazy for pursuing financial independence will come to you for advice about how to escape their own financial traps. As I walked across campus after the event, I reflected on the journey from being called lazy for leaving work on time to being invited to share my expertise with future business leaders. The transformation had been gradual but complete. The colleagues who'd criticized my work ethic had eventually recognized the wisdom of my approaches. The lifestyle choices they'd mocked had enabled freedom they'd never achieved. The financial strategies they'd dismissed as unrealistic had proven more effective than their conventional career advancement tactics. "You weren't lazy," Janet had told me during our final conversation before her retirement at 72. "You were the smartest person in the office. You understood something about work and money that the rest of us missed entirely." "It wasn't about intelligence," I'd replied. "It was about questioning assumptions and being willing to do things differently, even when everyone else thought I was wrong." "What would you tell your younger self if you could go back?" "To trust my instincts and start even earlier." The criticism was temporary, but the benefits of financial independence have lasted a lifetime. 40 years after my retirement, I was living proof that questioning conventional wisdom about work and money could produce extraordinary results. The colleagues who'd called me lazy were still working or had retired with minimal savings. The lifestyle choices they'd criticized had enabled decades of freedom they'd never experienced. They'd been right about one thing: I was different from them. But I wasn't lazy. I was strategic, efficient, and willing to prioritize long-term freedom over short-term social approval. And that difference had made all the difference. 40 years after my retirement, I was living proof that questioning conventional wisdom about work and money could produce extraordinary results. The colleagues who'd called me lazy were still working or had retired with minimal savings. The lifestyle choices they'd criticized had enabled decades of freedom they'd never experienced. They'd been right about one thing: I was different from them. But I wasn't lazy. I was strategic, efficient, and willing to prioritize long-term freedom over short-term social approval. And that difference had made all the difference. The ripple effects of my early retirement had extended far beyond my personal circumstances. My story had become part of a broader cultural shift that was fundamentally changing how society approached work, money, and life design. What had started as an individual response to workplace criticism had evolved into a movement that was reshaping economic policy and social expectations. "You've become something of a legend," Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, told me during an interview for her book about the financial independence movement. "Your story is cited in academic papers, policy proposals, and business school curricula. You're probably the most documented case study of early retirement in modern history." Dr. Chen was a behavioral economist who'd spent 5 years researching the psychological and sociological impacts of the financial independence movement. Her work had influenced government policy discussions about retirement age, Social Security, and universal basic income. "What's interesting," she continued, "is that your approach has been validated by decades of research in behavioral economics and organizational psychology. The efficiency techniques you developed intuitively have become standard practices in high-performance organizations." The academic validation was satisfying but unnecessary. I'd known my approaches were effective because they'd produced the results I'd wanted. The fact that researchers had later confirmed their effectiveness through controlled studies was interesting, but not surprising. "The more significant impact," Dr. Chen noted, "is how your story has changed social narratives about work and success. Young people now grow up with examples of alternative career paths. They understand that working until 65 isn't their only option." This cultural shift was evident in employment trends, consumer behavior, and political discussions. The concept of quiet quitting had emerged as younger workers refused to accept the overtime culture that had defined previous generations. Remote work had become standard practice, proving that productivity didn't require physical presence in an office. "Companies are struggling to attract and retain talent using traditional incentive structures," Dr. Chen explained. "Young workers prioritize flexibility, autonomy, and work-life balance over salary and promotional opportunities. They've learned from examples like yours that time is more valuable than money." The conversation took place in my home office, which had become an informal pilgrimage site for people interested in financial independence. I regularly hosted visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how someone had achieved early retirement decades before the concept became mainstream. "What's the most common misconception people have about your story?" Dr. Chen asked. "That it was about being lazy or avoiding work," I replied. "The truth is that financial independence required more discipline, creativity, and strategic thinking than traditional career advancement. I worked harder on building wealth than most people work on their jobs. But you made it look easy. Because I focused on systems and efficiency rather than visible effort. Most people confuse activity with achievement. They think working long hours demonstrates commitment, but it often just demonstrates poor time management." The interview continued for 3 hours, covering topics that had become central to discussions about the future of work. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in how my approach to efficiency had influenced organizational behavior and productivity research. "Your techniques for identifying high-impact activities and eliminating low-value work are now taught in business schools," she said. "Companies pay consultants millions of dollars to implement systems you developed through personal experimentation." "The principles aren't complicated," I replied. "Focus on outcomes rather than activities. Eliminate meetings that don't produce decisions. Automate routine tasks. Question whether work is actually necessary before doing it." Simple principles, but difficult to implement in organizations that reward visible effort over effective results. The difficulty of implementation explained why so many people continued to follow unsustainable work patterns, despite having access to better alternatives. Cultural change required more than individual awareness. It required institutional transformation that challenged existing power structures and reward systems. "That's why policy changes are so important," Dr. Chen observed. "Individual optimization can only go so far when operating within systems that incentivize counterproductive behavior." The policy implications of the financial independence movement had become a major focus of political and economic discussions. Countries were experimenting with universal basic income programs, reduced work weeks, and alternative measures of economic success that prioritize human well-being over GDP growth. Finland's 4-day workweek experiment showed increased productivity and improved worker satisfaction, Dr. Chen noted. Belgium's Universal Basic Income pilot program has reduced poverty and enabled more people to pursue education and entrepreneurship. These policy changes validate what people like you have been demonstrating for decades, that human flourishing doesn't require maximizing work hours or consumption levels. The conversation was interrupted by a video call from my niece, Lisa, who was now 35, the same age I'd been when I retired. She'd followed a modified version of my approach, achieving financial independence through a combination of high-income tech work and aggressive saving. "Uncle Marcus, I wanted to let you know that I submitted my resignation today," she said, her face glowing with excitement. "I'm officially retiring next month." Lisa had been documenting her journey to financial independence through a blog that had attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. Her story demonstrated how the principles I'd discovered through trial and error could be applied systematically by people who understood the underlying concepts from the beginning. "Congratulations," I said. "What are your plans for retirement?" "I'm going to travel for 6 months, then start a nonprofit focused on financial literacy education. I want to help people understand that they have more choices than they think." "Your blog has already helped thousands of people," Dr. Chen observed. "The comment section is filled with success stories from people who've implemented your strategies." Lisa's influence illustrated how the financial independence movement had evolved beyond individual achievement to social transformation. People weren't just pursuing early retirement for personal freedom. They were using their financial independence to create positive change in their communities and industries. "The most rewarding part," Lisa said, "is seeing how people's lives improve when they gain control over their finances. They become more confident, more creative, more willing to take risks on meaningful projects." After the call ended, Dr. Chen returned to her questions about long-term societal impacts. "Do you think the financial independence movement will continue to grow, or is it reaching saturation?" she asked. "It's still in the early stages," I replied. "Most people are aware of the concept now, but few have implemented the strategies consistently. Cultural change takes generations, not decades." "What obstacles do you see to broader adoption?" "Psychological resistance to delayed gratification, social pressure to maintain expensive lifestyles, and institutional systems that benefit from keeping people financially dependent on employment." The obstacles were significant, but not insurmountable. Each generation was more open to alternative approaches than the previous one. Technology was making wealth building more accessible through automated investing, online education, and reduced barriers to entrepreneurship. "The pandemic accelerated many trends that support financial independence," I noted. Remote work, reduced commuting costs, reassessment of priorities, and increased focus on economic security. People realized that their jobs weren't as secure as they'd assumed, and that life was too short to spend entirely on work they didn't enjoy. Dr. Chen nodded. "The data shows significant increases in savings rates, investment account openings, and interest in alternative career paths since 2020. Young people especially are rejecting the assumption that they need to work until they're elderly. They're planning careers around wealth building rather than just income maximization." The conversation continued into the evening, covering topics that had become central to policy discussions about the future of work and economic systems. Dr. Chen was working on recommendations for government agencies and international organizations that were grappling with the implications of technological automation and changing worker expectations. "Your story provides a template for how individuals can thrive in an economy that no longer provides traditional employment security," she said. "But it also raises questions about systemic changes needed to support broader prosperity." "What kind of systemic changes?" "Educational curricula that include financial literacy and entrepreneurship, tax policies that support wealth building rather than consumption, social safety nets that provide security without creating dependency. Most importantly, cultural shifts that value human potential over economic productivity." The discussion reminded me of conversations I'd had with policymakers and economists over the years. The financial independence movement had highlighted contradictions in economic systems that measured success through employment levels and consumer spending rather than human flourishing and sustainable prosperity. The current system assumes that people need to work 40 hours per week until they're elderly, I observed. But technology has made it possible to meet human needs with much less work. We could have a society where everyone has economic security and time to pursue meaningful activities. What would that look like? Shorter work weeks, universal basic income, emphasis on education and creativity rather than consumption and competition. People would work because they found it meaningful, not because they needed paychecks for survival. Your example proves that such a society is possible, Dr. Chen said. You've been living that reality for 40 years. The realization was profound. My early retirement hadn't just been a personal achievement, it had been a proof of concept for alternative economic arrangements that could benefit everyone. The strategies I developed for individual wealth building could be adapted for social policy that supported widespread prosperity. That's why your story is so important, Dr. Chen continued. It demonstrates that the assumptions underlying our economic system aren't inevitable. People can choose different relationships with work and money. And when enough people make different choices, the system itself changes to accommodate those preferences. The interview concluded with Dr. Chen asking about my legacy and long-term impact on society. 40 years from now, how do you think people will remember your contribution to the financial independence movement, she asked. I hope they won't remember me at all, I replied. I hope the ideas will have become so mainstream that no one needs to remember where they came from. The goal was never to be famous or influential. The goal was to live freely and help others understand that they could do the same. If the movement succeeds, early retirement will be so common that no one will consider it remarkable. People will simply assume that working until you're elderly is optional rather than required. Dr. Chen packed up her recording equipment and prepared to leave. Thank you for sharing your story. The book will help people understand that financial independence isn't just about money. It's about human potential and social transformation. The most important message, I said, is that individuals have more power than they realize. You don't need to wait for systemic change to start making different choices about work and money. But individual change does contribute to systemic transformation. Every person who achieves financial independence makes it easier for others to imagine that possibility. After Dr. Chen left, I reflected on how my story had evolved from personal experiment to social movement. The decision to prioritize efficiency over appearance, boundaries over approval, and long-term freedom over short-term consumption had produced ripple effects that extended far beyond my individual circumstances. The colleagues who'd called me lazy had been witnessing the early stages of a cultural transformation that would ultimately reshape how society thought about work, money, and human potential. They'd criticized approaches that threatened their understanding of how the world worked, not realizing that their criticism was documenting the emergence of new paradigms. You were ahead of your time, people often told me. But I'd simply been willing to question assumptions and experiment with alternatives, when others were content to follow conventional paths. The timing had been crucial to my success, but the principles were universal. Every generation faced choices about how to balance work and life, consumption and saving, individual achievement and social contribution. The beautiful thing about financial independence, I'd told Lisa during one of our conversations, is that it gives you the freedom to focus on what actually matters, rather than what you think you're supposed to want. What matters most changes as you get older, she'd replied, but having the freedom to choose is valuable at any age. The conversation had taken place in my garden, where I'd been growing vegetables and flowers for 30 years. The garden had become a metaphor for the patient, consistent effort that produced lasting results. Seeds planted decades earlier had grown into mature trees that provided shade and fruit for the entire neighborhood. Your approach to investing was like gardening, Lisa had observed. You planted seeds early and let time and compound interest do the work. Most people want immediate results, I'd replied. They try to get rich quickly, rather than building wealth systematically over time. The financial independence movement teaches patience and long-term thinking in a culture that emphasizes instant gratification. The garden had also become a gathering place for the extended community of people who'd been influenced by my story. Former colleagues, students, researchers, and fellow early retirees would visit to discuss life design, wealth building, and social transformation. "This is what retirement should look like," Sarah had said during one of her visits. "Not sitting around waiting to die, but creating value and building relationships on your own terms." Sarah had been retired for 5 years and was thriving in ways she'd never imagined during her corporate career. She'd started a consulting business that helped other executives transition to retirement, combining her professional experience with financial independence principles. "The hardest part of retirement," she'd told me, "is unlearning the belief that your value comes from your productivity and income." "Society teaches us that we are what we do for work," I'd replied. "But that's only true if you accept society's definition of identity." Financial independence gives you the freedom to define yourself based on your values and interests rather than your employment status. The conversation had continued for hours, covering topics that had become central to discussions about aging, purpose, and social contribution. Sarah had discovered that retirement could be more fulfilling than employment if approached with intention and creativity. "I'm doing more meaningful work now than I ever did in corporate jobs," she'd said. "The difference is that I'm choosing projects based on impact rather than income." "That's the ultimate benefit of financial independence," I'd replied. "You can optimize for meaning rather than money." As I tended my garden in the evening light, I reflected on the journey from being called lazy for leaving work on time to becoming a catalyst for social transformation. The criticism had been painful at the time, but it had ultimately validated the importance of questioning conventional wisdom and pursuing alternative approaches. The colleagues who'd criticized my work ethic had been defending a system that had trapped them in unsustainable patterns. They'd attacked me for demonstrating that their sacrifices were unnecessary and their assumptions were incorrect. "You threatened their worldview," Dr. Chen had observed. "If your approach was valid, it meant they'd been making unnecessary compromises for decades." "That's why social change is so difficult," I'd replied. "People resist information that contradicts their existing beliefs and behaviors. But eventually the evidence becomes overwhelming. Results speak louder than criticism." The evidence had accumulated over 40 years of financial independence, demonstrating that alternative approaches to work and money were not only viable but superior to conventional strategies. The movement had grown from individual experimentation to social transformation, influencing policy discussions and cultural expectations. "Your story proves that one person can make a difference," Dr. Chen had said. "Individual choice, when taken to its logical conclusion, becomes social change." "The most important legacy," I'd replied, "is that people understand they have choices they didn't know existed." Every person who achieves financial independence makes it easier for others to imagine that possibility. The movement grows through example rather than argument. 50 years after my retirement, I was invited to speak at a conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the financial independence movement. The event brought together researchers, policymakers, and practitioners from around the world to discuss the impact of early retirement strategies on society and economics. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference organizer announced, "please welcome Marcus Chen, whose story of early retirement at age 35 helped launch the modern financial independence movement." The introduction felt surreal. I'd never intended to launch a movement. I'd simply been trying to escape workplace criticism and create a better life for myself. The fact that my personal decisions had influenced millions of people was both humbling and overwhelming. 50 years ago," I began, "I was called lazy for leaving work on time and focusing on efficiency rather than visible effort. My colleagues couldn't understand why someone would prioritize boundaries over advancement opportunities. Today, the approaches they criticized are considered best practices in organizational management. The financial strategies they dismissed as unrealistic are taught in business schools worldwide." The audience included people from multiple generations who'd been influenced by the financial independence movement. Some had achieved early retirement themselves. Others had used financial independence principles to create more sustainable careers. A few were policymakers who'd implemented systemic changes based on movement insights. "The most important lesson," I continued, "is that questioning assumptions can lead to extraordinary results. The conventional wisdom about work and money isn't necessarily correct just because it's widely accepted." Every generation faces choices about how to balance individual freedom with social expectations. The financial independence movement has helped people understand that they have more options than they were taught to believe. The presentation covered the evolution of the movement from individual strategy to social transformation. I discussed how early retirement had evolved from radical lifestyle choice to mainstream career option, and how the principles had influenced policy discussions about work, retirement, and economic systems. The movement has achieved something remarkable, I noted. It has changed cultural narratives about what's possible and necessary in terms of work and consumption. Young people now grow up with examples of alternative career paths. They understand that working until they're elderly is a choice rather than a requirement. The audience was particularly interested in discussing the broader implications of the movement for society and economics. Questions covered topics like universal basic income, reduced work weeks, and alternative measures of economic success. How do you respond to critics who argue that widespread early retirement would damage economic productivity? One participant asked. The evidence suggests the opposite, I replied. Countries that have implemented shorter work weeks and better work-life balance have seen increased productivity and innovation. The assumption that economic growth requires maximizing work hours is contradicted by decades of research, showing that well-rested, autonomous workers are more creative and effective. More importantly, the purpose of an economy should be to support human flourishing, not to maximize productivity for its own sake. The discussion continued for hours, covering topics that had become central to political and economic debates worldwide. The financial independence movement had evolved beyond individual lifestyle choice to become a framework for thinking about social policy and economic systems. Your personal experiment has become a template for social transformation, one researcher observed. The principles you developed for individual wealth building have been adapted for community development and economic policy. That's the power of example, I replied. People need to see that alternatives are possible before they can imagine implementing them. The movement has provided proof of concept for economic arrangements that prioritize human potential over consumption and competition. The conference concluded with discussions about the future of work and the potential for even more radical transformations in how society organizes economic activity. Participants were optimistic about the possibility of creating systems that supported widespread prosperity and human flourishing. The next 50 years will be crucial, the organizer noted. The movement has demonstrated that change is possible, but implementing that change at scale requires continued effort and creativity. The foundation has been laid, I replied. Now it's up to future generations to build on that foundation and create the society they want to live in. As I traveled home from the conference, I reflected on the journey from being called lazy for leaving work on time to being celebrated as a catalyst for social transformation. The criticism had been painful at the time, but it had ultimately validated the importance of questioning conventional wisdom and pursuing alternative approaches. The colleagues who'd criticized my work ethic had been defending a system that had trapped them in unsustainable patterns. They'd attacked me for demonstrating that their sacrifices were unnecessary and their assumptions were incorrect. You were right to question everything, I told myself. The conventional wisdom about work and money was indeed flawed, and the alternatives were indeed superior. The validation was satisfying but unnecessary. I'd known my approaches were effective because they'd produced the results I'd wanted. The fact that millions of people had later confirmed their effectiveness through personal experience was interesting, but not surprising. The most important legacy, I thought, is that people understand they have choices they didn't know existed. Every person who achieved financial independence made it easier for others to imagine that possibility. The movement grew through example rather than argument, demonstrating that alternative approaches to work and money were not only viable, but superior to conventional strategies. As I arrived home and walked through my garden, I reflected on the seeds I'd planted decades earlier, both literal and metaphorical. The vegetables and flowers had grown into a mature ecosystem that provided beauty and nourishment for the entire community. The ideas and examples had grown into a social movement that was transforming how people thought about work, money, and human potential. You weren't lazy, I told myself, remembering the criticism from 50 years earlier. You were strategic, efficient, and willing to prioritize long-term freedom over short-term social approval. And that difference made all the difference. The garden was quiet in the evening light, but I could sense the vitality beneath the surface. seeds sprouting, roots growing, new life emerging from patient cultivation. The financial independence movement was like that garden, a living system that continued to grow and evolve, producing abundance for everyone who participated in its development. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, I thought, recalling an old proverb. The second best time is now. People would continue to discover financial independence principles and apply them to their own lives. Each generation would face new challenges and opportunities, but the fundamental insights would remain relevant. Question assumptions, prioritize long-term freedom over short-term approval, and remember that you have more choices than you think. The movement I'd accidentally helped launch would continue to grow and evolve, long after I was gone. The ideas would outlive their originators, becoming part of humanity's collective wisdom about how to create lives of meaning and freedom. That's the best kind of legacy, I realized. Not fame or recognition, but contribution to human understanding that continues to benefit people long after you're gone. As I prepared for bed, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The criticism from colleagues had been painful at the time, but it had ultimately led to insights and experiences that had enriched not just my life, but the lives of millions of people worldwide. They called me lazy, I thought with a smile, but I was really just ahead of my time. The movement would continue to grow, and future generations would benefit from the examples and insights that had emerged from decades of experimentation and innovation. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for a world where financial independence was not just possible but expected. Tomorrow, I thought, someone else will question assumptions, experiment with alternatives, and discover new possibilities for human flourishing. And that's exactly as it should be. As I prepared for bed, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The criticism from colleagues had been painful at the time, but it had ultimately led to insights and experiences that had enriched not just my life, but the lives of millions of people worldwide. They called me lazy, I thought with a smile, but I was really just ahead of my time. The movement would continue to grow, and future generations would benefit from the examples and insights that had emerged from decades of experimentation and innovation. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for a world where financial independence was not just possible, but expected. Before sleep, I walked through my house one final time, observing the life I had built through 5 decades of freedom. The walls were lined with books I'd had time to read, photographs from travels I'd had freedom to take, and artwork created during the countless hours I'd spent pursuing interests rather than chasing paychecks. In my study, I opened the journal I'd kept throughout my retirement, a simple record of days spent exactly as I chose to spend them. 50 years of entries documenting a life designed around curiosity rather than obligation, relationships rather than networking, and meaning rather than money. The early entries revealed someone still adjusting to freedom, still deprogramming from the belief that productivity required misery. Day 127 of retirement. Spent the morning reading in the garden, felt guilty about not working, then remembered that was exactly the point. The middle years showed someone who had fully embraced autonomy, volunteered at the literacy center this morning, then spent the afternoon learning woodworking, evening with friends discussing philosophy. This is what life should feel like. The recent entries reflected someone who had witnessed their personal experiment become social transformation. Lisa called to thank me for showing her a different path. 3 more of her friends have achieved financial independence this year. The ripples continue spreading. I sat in my reading chair, the same chair where I'd planned my escape from corporate life 50 years earlier, and reflected on the mathematics of choice. My colleagues had worked approximately 2,000 hours per year for 45 years after I retired. That was 90,000 hours of their lives spent in conferences rooms, responding to emails, and managing workplace politics. I had spent those same 90,000 hours reading, traveling, building relationships, learning new skills, and helping others understand they had choices they didn't know existed. When measured in time, the only resource that truly mattered, the difference was staggering. The calculation was always simple. I wrote in my journal that night, would I rather have 40 years of freedom or 40 years of overtime? The answer seemed obvious, but most people never actually do the math. They called me lazy for choosing efficiency over appearance, boundaries over advancement, and long-term freedom over short-term approval. But laziness implies avoiding work. I didn't avoid work. I just redesigned the relationship between work and life. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Tom, now 85 and recently widowed, calling from the assisted living facility where he'd moved after his retirement 3 years earlier. "Marcus, I was thinking about our old office today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Do you remember that meeting where Sarah said you were lazy for leaving at 5 o'clock? I remember it well. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. We all worked so hard to impress people who forgot about us the moment we retired. We sacrificed our health, our families, our interests. For what? A slightly larger pension that barely covers medical expenses?" Tom's voice caught with emotion. "You were the only one who understood that time was more valuable than money. While we were competing for promotions, you were building a life. While we were staying late to show commitment, you were becoming free." "It's not too late to enjoy retirement," I replied, though we both knew his options were limited by health issues that decades of stress had exacerbated. "It is too late for me," he said quietly, "but maybe not for my grandchildren. I've been telling them about your approach. I want them to understand they have choices we never knew we had." After we hung up, I returned to my journal, thinking about the conversations I'd had with thousands of people over the years, some who'd embraced financial independence principles, others who'd dismissed them as unrealistic. "The sad truth," I wrote, "is that most people will work until they're too old to enjoy freedom, then spend their final years wishing they'd made different choices. They'll have money but no time, or time but no health to enjoy it. The beautiful truth is that this outcome is entirely optional. Anyone can choose differently, but they have to be willing to question assumptions and ignore criticism from people who are threatened by alternative approaches." I thought about Sarah, who had finally achieved early retirement but often expressed regret about the decades she'd lost to conventional thinking. She'd created a fulfilling life in retirement, but she'd paid a steep price in stress and missed opportunities during her working years. "I spent 30 years climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall," she told me recently. "The view from the top wasn't worth the climb." Janet had never achieved financial independence, working until 72 and passing away just 3 years into retirement. Her obituary mentioned her dedication to work and professional achievements, but it said nothing about the life she'd wanted to live outside the office. She was always planning to travel when she retired, her daughter had told me at the funeral. She had lists of places she wanted to visit, books she wanted to read, hobbies she wanted to pursue, but by the time she retired, she was too tired and sick to do any of it. These conversations reminded me why the financial independence movement mattered beyond individual benefit. It was about preserving human potential that was otherwise consumed by unnecessary work and deferred dreams. "Every person who achieves financial independence," I wrote, "represents not just individual freedom but collective wisdom about what's actually necessary versus what we're told is necessary." The movement grows because it offers proof that the conventional bargain, trading most of your life for financial security, is a false choice. You can have both security and freedom if you're willing to question assumptions about consumption and status. I closed the journal and prepared for sleep, thinking about the young person somewhere in the world who is currently being criticized for leaving work on time, questioning conventional wisdom, or prioritizing efficiency over appearance. They were probably feeling isolated and uncertain, wondering if their instincts were correct or if they should conform to expectations. "Trust your instincts," I wanted to tell them. "The criticism you're facing is evidence that you're on the right track. People only attack what threatens their worldview. 50 years from now, the people criticizing you will realize you were right, but you don't need to wait 50 years to benefit from being right. You can start now." The house was quiet as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring another day of freedom, another 24 hours to spend exactly as I chose, without meetings or deadlines or office politics or workplace drama. I closed my eyes, thinking about Sarah, Tom, and Janet, my former colleagues who had spent their lives working overtime while I had been building something different. They had called me lazy for leaving at 5 o'clock, for setting boundaries, for refusing to sacrifice my life for their definition of success. But I had retired at 35 while they worked until their 70s. I had spent 50 years in freedom while they spent 50 years in cubicles. I had helped transform society's understanding of work and money, while they had remained trapped in systems that consumed their lives. The final irony was perfect. The colleagues who had criticized me for being lazy had worked far harder than I ever did, for far longer than I ever had to, with far less to show for it in the end. They had been absolutely right about one thing: I was different from them. I just hadn't been lazy. I had been strategic. I had been efficient. I had been willing to be criticized for approaches that produced extraordinary results. And in the morning, I would wake up and choose exactly how to spend another day of the life I had designed for myself, while somewhere in the world another person would be called lazy for leaving work on time, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept that there was only one way to live. That person would face the same choice I had faced 50 years earlier: conform to expectations or trust their instincts about what was possible. I hoped they would choose freedom. I hoped they would ignore the criticism. I hoped they would understand that being called lazy by people trapped in unsustainable patterns was actually the highest compliment they could receive. The cycle would continue, and that was exactly as it should be. I had been free, and tomorrow I would be free again. The end.